So this video is the first in a series of looking at Unity for architects. And specifically we'll be going a little bit over the user interface and then looking a little bit about the terrain creation tools in sort of their free form. Then we'll start working later videos that begin merging Revit, SketchUp, 3ds Max, Rhino files into Unity as well. So let's just start with introducing Unity in general and how things are set up. And what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go File, and I'm going to start a brand new project. So I'm going to go File, New Project. This project file location is really important because when you're working with Unity, it's really important to understand that everything really in Unity is working through a system of links. So not unlike InDesign, where images aren't really in the InDesign file, they're only links to the file. That is kind of how Unity's working. So I'm setting up the entire directory folder right now. I'm going to go to my Unity projects folder, new folder, Unity video, and essentially setting up this Unity video right here. I'm only selecting the folder as a placeholder for everything inside of my project. For a typical architecture scene, a handful of things that I want to preload: the character controllers, light flares, skyboxes, standard assets, the terrain assets, and the basic water package. I'm going to go ahead and say create. So what Unity is doing right now is it's compiling a new set of folders, new assets that are going to go in those folders to begin building the scene. And like I mentioned, Unity really is very much what I like to equate it to is a stage. So in other programs, or Revit, Rhino, SketchUp, I'm going to be building props to put on the stage, and then Unity is very much this location where all of these things are going to converge, get touched up, be put in motion, and that I can start experiencing those in a different way using what Unity is, which is a video game creation engine. But for designers, for architects, it becomes a really powerful way to create immersive environments that we can start placing our work into in terms of design process and in terms of communication. It's also one of the best early gateways into doing virtual reality with the Oculus Rift, and so that's the other reason why I'm really excited about using Unity and beginning to teach that in our courses at Hammond School of Architecture. So right now I've got a scene launched, and this is in a brand new project. So a scene is part of an overall project. The default scene opens up with a single camera, and that single camera is listed here in my hierarchy. Everything that goes into, or all of my props that are going onto my stage, which is this 3D space, are going to show up underneath this hierarchy window. The project, all the project folders are listed right here. In fact, this is just sort of another view into Windows Explorer, or whatever it's called on the Mac side of thing. I have a Mac. I never remember what they call it, but the file folder directory. In fact, if I right click inside of the project view, I can say show in Explorer. This actually brings up the exact same folder structure that I can see inside of my project here underneath assets. If I go to assets, I have standard assets and assets mobile. If I put a new folder in that says delete, once I click Unity, you'll see that that folder has been added. Now the advantage of that is if I'm working on a design in Revit and I want to start doing walkthroughs, I want to start creating an iterative walkthrough of my design process, I want to do something that I'm going to be communicating with a client at any point along the process to update my Unity file, all I need to do is overwrite the file, or the FBX file that I'm exporting out of Revit, into my assets folder, and it's automatically going to update the 3D scene without me having to click inside of Unity or anything like that, because this is just placing links to objects. So it's a little bit different to learn. Once you get used to the system, it's a really powerful system. And again, the same thing as InDesign, or if you're if you ever used Lightwave and you had Modeler and Layout, it's that same kind of strategy, and it does work really well, but it's a little bit of a different strategy for most architects who are only used to working in one space. That said, Unity can do a little bit of modeling and a little bit of animation, but that's not where it excels. Although the animation tools have gotten much, much better, the modeling tools are still very, very simple. I definitely recommend modeling in other programs and bringing it into Unity. So the first thing that we want to add in working in Unity is a terrain. So I'm just going to go Game Object, Create Other, Terrain. And this is going to make an enormous terrain file. And I'm just using my wheel mouse to zoom out. I can use the right button on my mouse to orbit around. And then I also have my little 3D widget right here that I can click on different things or can sort of drag or click on that middle box to begin moving around. The terrain itself, I can see its properties. I've got the terrain selected in my hierarchy view. The inspector over here on the right are going to give me all my options that I have to work with the terrain. So one of the first things I want to do with this terrain is I can click on this gear tab right here. And I'll notice I've got resolution settings for my terrain. Now, the version of Unity that I have is a little bit newer. You might notice that there might be terrain showing up on the drop-down list here. The resolution of the terrain, in some of the previous versions, I think what we have at Drury, the version that we have on our image, is going to be, you're going to want to go to terrain, from this drop-down list and set resolution in that location. But 2000 by 2000, Unity works entirely in meters in the metric system. So this is about 1.25 miles by 1.25 miles right now. I'm going to drop this down to something a little bit smaller, a little bit easier to manage, to 500 by 500. So this is more, a little bit past the city block level, but not something that's sort of working at the small district area, 1.25 miles by 1.25 miles. We want to keep something a little bit smaller. If we want to start working on, outside of the building scale, mountains in the distance, that kind of thing, what I typically do is what most game designers are going to do, and that is have the terrain that you're interacting with at a slightly smaller scale that I add more detail to. And then I can simply put in a second terrain that's much larger, a little bit less detail, that sort of floats underneath this piece. And so that's a trick I employ pretty often in terms of doing architectural work. So with this terrain, what I want to start doing first is adding some color and texture to it. So I'm going to do that by, again, selecting my terrain. I can either select it here in the 3D view, or for me, most usually I'm selecting things over here in the hierarchy. And I want to go ahead and begin adding some color to it. So I'm going to select the paintbrush, which is Paint Texture, Edit Texture, and Add Texture. And what I'm going to do is select on my texture map right here. I think the older versions, you're not going to see a little select button, you see a little dot to the side. Same kind of thing. The grass and rock is a nice place to start. This is called your splat map. It's the first texture map that goes down onto your overall terrain, and it's going to be tiling at 15 meters by 15 meters. So you can see the tiling at first looks generally terrible, but what you want to remember is that I'm typically working at a more experiential level, not an overview level, and the tiling doesn't look nearly so bad when you're closer into the actual view. So if we set that view to perspective, you can see the tiling isn't too terrible. But then also, the other thing to think about is inside of Unity, the terrain editing tools and texture map tools are excellent. So I'm going to have multiple of these textures as I work my way along, adding up complexity, beginning to deform this, and put grass and ground cover over the top of it. So there's a lot of things that are going to start happening with this terrain that will break up this tiling. So the splat map, that initial texture map that you put down, is simply a base, and we're going to start working over the top of that. So the next thing that I'm going to do is add in trees. So I'm going to go to the Tree tab, Edit Trees, Add Trees. And by default, the list that I have, the only tree available right now is a palm tree. But let's just go ahead and put that in to begin with. I'm going to apply a bin factor of 1. Once we put in some wind and things like that, that bin factor will allow those trees to move around. I'm going to click Add. And what you can see that I can do with this is I've got a brush, and I can start painting in a forest of trees. So that was just done with the left mouse. I can come back and erase the forest. I can change my brush size, and I can change the tree density with the brush. So if I have a larger brush size, a lower density, I only get a handful of trees at a time. Let's go ahead and erase those. So typically what I start working with is a mid-sized brush, something along that line, and these brushes are in relationship to the overall size and scale of your topography, which is one of the reasons why 500 by 500 seems to work really well for me. One of the next things that I like to do is, a lot of times I'm not going to have time to add in a lot of detail to the site. So I'm going to be using the same tree often over and over and over again, because that's just not something that I have a lot of time to invest in. I'm more worried about the building and the experience that I'm trying to create there. So what I'm going to do is use the same tree pretty often, but what I do have is a really nice tool is color variation, height variation, and width variation. So if I increase those, you can see that I get some, even though that is the same tree over and over again, by default I get some nice variables with it, and they start to really look like different trees. On further inspection you can start to definitely tell that they're the same tree, but just increasing those variables on those sliders do quite a bit of work for me in terms of convincing that it's not the same tree repeated. Underneath standard assets, I'm going to go ahead and go to character controller, and one of the next things I want to do is load in this first person controller. So if I click on that, you'll see that the first person controller looks a bit like a big pill. That is a 2-meter tall object, if I remember correctly. So it's right about 6 feet in height, if you're not used to the metric scale. It has a camera attached to it, and it has a script system already attached to it that allow me to use the mouse for look, the keypad for motion, and I can start setting motion speed, and what every architectural walkthrough does need, and that is a jump function. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to slide that directly in right here. And one of the next key little things to show you in terms of working with the interface is the F key. Really like the F key, that zooms in on the current object. So moving this object around, I have it selected. You can see it's now in the hierarchy view right here, first person controller. I'm going to select the move key, and I'm going to move it up so it is just slightly above my terrain. If I want this to start facing towards the forest, I can select the rotate key. I'm just going to swivel this around right here so that it is starting to look into the forest. So this pill is also my collider. So it is going to detect any object that I bring in that I also say is a collider, and the terrain by default is a collider. It is going to bump into, so I can navigate around with it. So already at this simple little point here, I can hit the play button, and I can begin moving through 3D space using either the arrow keys or the WASD keys, and using my mouse to look around. So already early on I'm getting at this level of immersion and being inside of something. And it's moving quickly, and it's moving all in real time as opposed to typical pre-rendered animations. So I'm going to go ahead and hit the stop button. If you notice, the lighting was absolutely terrible, so let's add that in really quick. Game object, create other. And again, I'm not going to do an advanced lighting setup yet, but let's put in a directional light. So again, the location of the directional light doesn't matter. That's essentially a sheet of light covering the entire scene. And I typically like to kind of move it off to the side, simply to make it a little easier to see, a little easier to select. So if we hit play again, you can see that I now have a much more vibrant atmosphere in terms of sky. Now, in most the versions that you're going to see of Unity, the light is not going to have shadows. If I set this to soft shadows, it's going to say Pro version only. So that is one of the features from the free version to the Pro version that you're going to lose. But what I found is you can do quite a bit, especially with the lighting effects, without the Pro version. Learning the software, you can definitely learn, an incredible amount of the software and dive pretty deep into this program without investing any money yet. And you can build some pretty impressive walkthroughs, things like that, with completely within the free version. And we'll get into that in the next series in terms of adding in some artificial lighting and beginning to build up some shadows and things like that. So the next thing that we want to look at is back with the terrain tool. And that is beginning to add in some actual topography with this. And I do have a lesson on using, if I've used a topography coming out of SketchUp or topography coming out of Revit that is very precise, it is actually matching 100% existing conditions. But it's a little bit tricky. It's definitely not the place to start in Unity, and also it's so worth showing how Unity deals with the artistic side of working with topography because it's just so much fun. So with my terrain selected, I can go to the raise and lower terrain tool right here, which again acts just exactly like a paintbrush. I'm just going to set my brush size up a little bit. And I'm going to drop the opacity down. That's just how impactful or how fast things are going to raise up and down. So I'm starting with sort of a smooth brush, and I can just move my mouse around and it's going to start building terrain. I can go right where the trees are. It'll just go ahead and take the trees with it. Doesn't really care. It's pretty simple to work with. I can do single clicks, or I can move my mouse in an area for a little bit of a longer time and it'll actually pull things up a little bit steeper. I can start connecting pieces together to make sort of a line of hills or mountains that come together. And I can certainly change my brush type to something that's a little bit rougher as well to get a completely different kind of effect. Or if I want to sort of roughen things up a bit, I can also come in over the top of something like that and just do some single clicks to add in a little bit more detail to it. So if I look at something like that, that looks pretty ridiculous right now to me. I'm not too wild about it. So one of the next tools over simply allows me to smooth things out. So think of this as taking a piece of virtual sandpaper to what I've built here, and I can just come back over, and I'm holding the shift button now to kind of move things down, and that allows me to just sort of smooth things out a bit. So if I move in a little bit closer here to where my camera is, I can select this type of brush, I can drop the opacity down, set the brush size up. I need to actually switch that to raise and lower. And I can begin modeling a little bit of surface texture for this to walk on. So, I'm going beyond sort of thinking about bump maps or something like that, and I'm actually building up a little bit of surface. So if I select my first-person controller, you'll notice that that's actually sitting underneath the surface of things. Let me show you what's going to happen really quick if I do that. If I hit the play button, I actually don't collide with the terrain and just begin falling infinitely. I don't really have anything underneath me to catch it at all. So that happens often to me, especially when you start using Unity. So I'm just going to select my first-person controller, move it, and again just position it so it's slightly above the terrain. So now when I start that file, I land on the terrain, and I've got something I can start walking over or through. So if you notice, there are times where I can't walk over something, and that's because the first-person controller has maximum slope limits. So that's something, if I'm building a path that I really want to consider, what kind of terrain do I want to put that on? What's going to make sense? How do I start moving around? So if, let's say I wanted to bring somebody through a location right over here, I might again select my terrain, select my tree tool, decrease the size of my brush and begin. I'm going to hold the shift button down and begin opening this up just a bit. And I'd probably also come in and look at how rough some of these surfaces are, and I might choose to smooth some of these surfaces out a bit. doing something like that. And at that point, I might also want to change the texture on the ground. So to do that, I can go back into my texture settings, edit texture, add a new texture. And I really don't have anything else in this default scene that I could start to add. So what you can do is I can go to Window and the Asset Store. And the Asset Store has lots of collections of Unity things. I could certainly begin building my own texture map for the site and the terrain, but there is an excellent terrain asset package that Unity has put together that is definitely the place to start when you're just diving into Unity in terms of having the right kind of texture maps to work on the ground plane, additional trees, all that kind of stuff. And you know, for those of you that don't know me, I live way out in the boonies. I'm on satellite internet. This typically pops right up pretty quickly, but it is just deathly slow on my machine here. So I'm going to go down to, this is finally loading up. It looks shockingly like the iTunes Marketplace. Top free, and you can see right here is the terrain assets. I'm not going to load that in because it's about 45 megs. It'll take like 20 minutes on my computer, which is really sad. But I have a different way to sort of bring that package in. I'm going to go to Assets, which is essentially what you're importing from the Asset Store. But I can also, if I have something already downloaded, I can go Assets, Import Package, and I believe that I'm going to be doing an Import Custom Package. Unity Projects, I have my terrain assets right here. And so the terrain assets is a collection of texture maps, trees, and ground cover. I'm just going to go ahead and put import, and this will build a new piece under my asset package here. And we'll add one different tree type and one or two different texture types to begin showing how those things work. Oh, and we'll definitely add in a little bit of the grass as well to begin building up some ground cover. So this is all sort of decompressing and opening, and you can see that this is now underneath assets, terrain assets, bushes, grass, rocks, textures, and trees. So let's just go back into our texture maps, edit, add texture. Now I have a much larger list of textures that I can start working with. And so let's just do this rocky pathway here. And I'll say add. I'm going to switch. You can see this little blue stripe. That is the texture map I'm currently working with. I'm going to switch to the rocky path. Use a slightly harder edge brush. The brush that I have seems to be right about the right size right now. Let's say that I want to bring somebody right through that. So I'm just going to start painting that texture map in to create a little bit of a difference across there. So when I hit the play button now, I can see that there is some control over this versus this edge, where this is looking a little bit more natural. This is looking like it's placed with a little bit more attention. So palm trees, too many palm trees. Let's add in some different types of trees. So I'm going to go edit tree, add tree. And where we just had a palm tree, now we have quite a bit of variety. Nothing remarkable, and there are more trees that we can find. But let's add in a willow tree. It's a good start. It's a pretty heavy polygon object. Bin factor again of 1. So I'm not going to do a whole forest of willow trees. That would be a disaster. But let's say that I just want to place one willow tree right here at the beginning. I'm going to drop my brush size all the way down to 1, my density all the way up to 100. That gives me sort of a point in space, which a lot of times is what we want to do with a tree if we're working with a certain kind of terrain. Let's say I want a willow tree right there. It would really help if I actually had my willow tree selected. Willow tree right there. So that way it's kind of a nice little starting point. So if I hit play, sort of starting underneath this willow tree and ready to move across the path. Let's add in one more tree type. Let's do the alder, the bin factor of 1, add little bit smaller brush size. Again, a lot of color variation, height variation, and width variation. And I'm really going to drop the tree density down here as well. It looks like something is, there we go. Yeah, there, the initial show there is the billboard. I think it's a little bit of something with my video card. Hopefully those will be playing okay. Let's see if we can add in one or two others along the path here. We'll see how those are going to play. Yeah, they're playing fine, they're just not previewing particularly well. So I've got alders, a willow, and palm trees. And you can see off in the distance how Unity manages. It does turn things into billboards. And if we continue to have that problem on other scenes, I can set that a different way later. So not too concerning to me right now. Okay, so we've talked about building up terrain, adding in trees. Let's talk last about adding in ground cover. So if I select the next to the trees is my ground cover, and again I'm going to go closer to the camera, and this does add in geometry. None of these things are free, even though they're running really fast in Unity right now. Each one does take a hit in terms of how fast Unity is going to perform. So there are maximums that you're going to get to, and ground cover is going to be the same type of thing. So you want to be really smart and specific in terms of how you're going to use it. But let's go to Edit Details and add a grass texture. The first thing I need to do is add my clip map in. And I'm going to just use this grass texture right here. I'm going to set, because of the squint test on grass, a lot of times if grass is just bright green, all that you can see when you're looking at these visuals is just glaringly green grass. I'm going to tone it down quite a bit to some darker colors, a little bit more muted. And then I'm going to go ahead and say, let's look at the height. My maximum height of probably 1.5 meters, my minimum height of 0.5, and then say add. And I know that the grass comes in really dense. If I do that, it comes in just as really intense ground cover. So I know what I do want to use is a brush, slightly larger brush, probably with a little bit more of a sporadic pattern like that. And I typically drop the opacity pretty far down and the target strength pretty far down. So that way what I'm starting to get is sort of clusters of grass that are growing along the edge of this pathway. And perhaps at my starting point a little bit in front of the camera as well. And so now when I hit play, you'll see I've got a little bit of ground cover starting to work. And I should probably have opened this up a little bit more in front of me to start getting at this idea of moving towards a path in terms of where I would start placing architecture. So that's basically the introduction to Unity, other than one more key piece. Always hit stop when you're ready to do this. File, save scene as. The scene, again, the scene is another link because in your project you can have multiple scenes, but typically how I like to set this up, so I'm on my Unity video folder, assets, I'm going to do new folder, scenes, scene 1. And now that is the scene that I'm working with, scene1.unity, inside of my Unity project.